Have you ever gone out fishing with somebody and watched them reel in fish after fish, and for some reason you haven't caught one? No, is it just me? That was me the other day. I watched Andy reel in fish after fish after fish, and stubborn old me refused to change up what I was doing.
So that brings to light a very important point when you're fishing with almost any kind of lure, and we'll give you some specific examples, but your presentation speed can matter more than your color or your lure choice oftentimes. And we don't mean like, how are you going to present this slideshow, or how are you going to present, no, that's not, we're talking about presenting lures to fish. So welcome to the Level Up Fishing Podcast. I am Andy Cochran.
And I am Stormy Cochran.
And we want to come to you with this episode and give you a few pointers for hopefully getting more fish caught and landed for you.
So like I was saying, the other day, Andy and I actually got to sneak away. We got to do some shoreline fishing, and it was so much fun. I had actually snuck away 4 times and got to go fishing 4 days in a row. And it was really good fishing, but I couldn't land them. And it was so frustrating. And the more frustrated I got, the worse it got. So when I then proceeded to see Andy catching fish after fish, I was like, all right, I give. What are you doing?
That's one of those examples where the fishing is really good, but the catching is not as good.
Yes.
So one of the subtle things that we picked up on throughout and this was in the evening, was presentation speed. Absolutely mattered a ton. Tried several different lures and several different jigs, and regardless of the type or color of lure we were throwing, the speed in which we were retrieving them either resulted in a swirl and a miss, or a hookup and a land. And it was just that subtle difference of fast versus slow.
And I was being stubborn, and that is one of the things in fishing. If you are a stubborn fisherman, you're probably shooting yourself in the foot. And I was being stubborn, and I was using one of our swim finesse jigs, which is my absolute go-to favorite in the fall. But I was clearly retrieving it way too fast, and the jig was way too heavy to go slow, because then I ended up on the bottom, and that's not what you want either. So I needed to switch it up, and I just absolutely refused to, because I love the swim finesse jig.
And so a lot of times when you're fishing and that becomes the scenario, what you're throwing is getting bites, but it's not getting a full commitment from the fish to latch on and get hooked. You know, oftentimes that can be a color change that's needed, or the size or the profile of the bait that needs to change. So in that scenario, I switched up to our pill head, which was and I was using a 1/8 ounce pill head with our fin candy. And based on the conditions, I chose a white one because it's very flashy and bright in low light conditions. And the finesse jig that Stormy was throwing was also white, and so I felt like the color was right, but maybe there was a presentation difference that needed to happen to turn those into caught fish versus missed fish. So I tied that pill head on and I started throwing it, and got pretty much the same results right away as she was getting. So it didn't really matter that the bait was smaller. I was still missing them. And so I was using a cast and retrieve technique with that little jig head that we were using like a month or so ago when the water was much warmer. And I was able to throw it out there and basically like shake my rod tip and swim it back to the boat. We were in the boat, it doesn't really matter, but those fish were that much more aggressive with the higher water temperature, so I was able to bring that bait back to me pretty quick and relatively shallow in the water column, and those fish would commit and hook up almost every cast. But this time that was not working. They were grabbing the tail, they were pulling it. She was having the same results with with the swim jig with our swimmer on the back of it. They were grabbing the tail and running around with it, but not getting the hook. So the next couple of casts, I threw it out there, and it was basically, I would call it a yo-yo technique. So you like lift your rod tip really high and then drop the jig down on a slack line. So it does two different things. It covers more of the water column up and down, but the second thing it does is it brings the bait back to you a whole lot slower. So you're moving it more vertically in the water column rather than horizontally across the water column. And I hooked one and landed it, but it was hooked kind of funny. And I noticed that it bit that jig on the fall. So the next couple of casts I did that, and I missed a couple bites. And so then after that, what I got clued into with the missed bites, including the caught one, was those fish were a little bit deeper. They were probably 10 feet deep. So what I started doing was throwing it out and counting to like 5 to let it get down in the water column a little bit. And then basically just pulling it really slow back towards me rather than lifting my rod really high. I was just kind of pulling the bait towards me and then just very slowly dropping my rod tip, but keeping tension on the line to let it gain a little more depth and then pull it towards me. So I was moving that jig as slow as I could, but not letting it hit the bottom. So then once I figured that out, that was as slow as I could fish that thing without getting it stuck on the bottom. Then it was fish after fish after fish. Once you figured out you got to fish this thing as painfully slow as you possibly can.
And that's something where, one, knowing your tackle really helps. But two, knowing yourself as a fisherman. And the reason I'm so stubborn is I don't do slow well. I'm a highly energetic person. I know you guys can't tell that in this podcast, but I have a lot of energy and I like to move. I don't troll well. I don't ice fish well because I want to move. And so slow fishing, it's hard for me, but it's something I need to practice because it obviously made all the difference. Our lures were the same color. They were a little different in size. Mine was too heavy to fish slow, but they were pretty much spot on the same, and you were clearly catching fish and I wasn't, based on the speed in which I was retrieving my jig.
So we've talked in past episodes about jig head weight and how it affects the fall rate of your jig, and that is, this scenario is exactly what we were talking about. We went out with like fairly limited tackle because we just it was kind of on the whim. We just grabbed some stuff and ran to the lake. And so I happened to have some 1/8 ounce pill heads in my box. And so that it ended up working fine. But had I had a 1/16 ounce pill head, it probably would have worked even better because that jig would have fallen half the speed as the 1/8 ounce. And every single fish I caught, when we're talking like fish after fish, every one of those fish bit that jig on the fall. And it was on a controlled fall with my rod tip. I wasn't dropping the jig on a slack line because I knew that jig head was too heavy. And so I was able to control the fall rate by holding tension on my line and basically like making the weight of the jig pull my rod tip down towards the water rather than just dropping the rod tip and letting it fall on a slack line. So that's another way that you can control the fall rate of your jig if you don't have a lighter jig head that doesn't fall fast on its own. You can control the rate of the fall with your jig by keeping tension on your line, basically letting the jig pull your rod tip towards the water.
And obviously these are all things that take lots of practice and time on the water, but just lightening your jig head weight is a great start. And practicing casting it, because casting a 1/16 ounce jig head is a lot different than casting a 1/4 ounce jig head. It's a lot harder. It takes better rod really for the weight of the jig head. There's a lot of things that you can practice to level up your skill to get to the point where you're like Andy and you're playing a yo-yo with your jig.
We use that scenario with jigs a lot, but also during that same fishing time frame, I threw a jerk bait a lot because that's a very that's a really good bait to throw, especially given the time of year for trout. And you'll hear people talk about jerk baits across the board, whether it's bass or stripers or trout or whatever you're fishing for with a jerk bait. It's all about what they call the cadence, like a jerk, pause, jerk, pause, whatever it is. But the duration of the pause is probably the biggest factor in, as far as what we're talking about tonight, slowing your presentation down in certain conditions. The jerkbait's another really good example of a lure that gets thrown and often fished far too fast.
Yeah.
I can remember a few years ago when the lake wasn't frozen yet by the middle of January and we were fishing open water and throwing a jerkbait, and I would count to 15 before I would move my jerkbait again. And it was just like the most subtle little twitch, and then I would pause it. I think at first I was going all the way to 20, but the bites would come between 12 and 15. That's seconds. And so you're standing there 1,000, 2, 1,000, all the way to 15. And you'd get to like 12, 13, and all of a sudden your line would just move. There wasn't like a crazy hard bite or anything, but that was another scenario where you had to fish that thing it was almost painful to fish it that slow.
Yeah.
You'd jerk it, and then you'd look for birds, and you'd glass around and look for elk for a while, and then, oh yeah, I have a lure in the water, and you'd twitch it a couple times.
Go have coffee with a friend.
Yeah. And then after, but then once you figured that out, it was fish after fish.
And so all of that matters. So the whole point of this is just trying to slow down. And for some people, that means practicing slowing down, using lures that make you slow down, whatever it may be. Even, paring down your reel so it doesn't reel in line so quickly, learning about your tackle and figuring all that out, and different speeds and gear ratios and all that, and how that affects the way your lure comes in. But all of those things can help you slow down your lure and actually get more bites.
And obviously there's, where there's a yin, there's a yang. So there's also a time where you've got to speed it up.
Yeah.
And we'll notice that, especially on like post-front conditions with bass or something, where it's either one or the other. You're either finessing the heck out of things, using tiny little baits, trying to talk them into biting, or you're blowing stuff by them so fast they can't help but react to it.
Yeah. So where do you start?
So you always start in the middle. So that's a really common question when we talk about tube jigs or jig heads for ice fishing or any kind of jig head stuff. I always start off with the weight that's right in the middle.
Yep.
Because you can manipulate it to go slower or faster. And then if they don't just bite it, in that middle zone of kind of what seems to be the normal presentation. Like in our case where we learned that we really needed to slow stuff down, we could manipulate that middle-sized jig head to slow it down or speed it up. And once we learned that we needed to go much slower, the next more efficient move would be to put the much lighter jig head on because it would move slower. And so I guess that's kind of the routine. Start in the middle. You should be able to have a pretty good idea how to speed it up, how to slow it down based on how you're retrieving it. And then you can adjust the weight from there based on what you learn.
Well, and if you're casting your lure out there, if you have good tension on your line, you can sometimes, a lot of the time, feel if suddenly your line is going a different direction, if a fish has swirled around your line, if suddenly your lure goes funny, it's more than likely that fish has missed your lure because it's probably going by it too fast and it just couldn't get keyed in on where to strike. So try slowing it down a little bit.
So yeah, we see that with like really hard vibrating baits like a crankbait or a chatterbait or something. You'll be reeling it along and you can feel the vibration of that lure through your rod kind of the whole retrieve, and sometimes you'll feel like this kind of half-second pause in the lure's action, And usually that's a fish just missed it. And so you can make that same exact cast and then adjust your lure speed slower or faster. Try them both and then see if you can turn that into a bite.
So we hope this helps. And we hope next time you hit the water that you try different cadences. Speed it up, slow it down, see what those fish want. In a happy turn of events, when it was absolutely pitch black outside, I finally hooked a fish and landed it and had to use my cell phone flashlight to figure out what species it was because it was so dark we couldn't see it.
So there's always the old saying, persistence pays.
And I never did change my lure.
Nope.
Well, thank you for listening to another episode of the Level Up Fishing Podcast.
And we will see you on the water.